I was telling him, Scott, the other day that it's funny how we had the last um, innovation talk, how we were just talking about something completely different than what we've been discussing for the past 3 months.
Yeah.
From innovation to, you know, the future of the world. And now it's like, how do you cope with something that just took the whole world by shock?
Yeah. It's quite incredible, isn't it? And yeah, in a strange kind of way, I find it really, really interesting just watching how people and countries are dealing with it, how industries are dealing with it, or not in some cases, and wondering what the world is going to look like in 3 months, 6 months, a year. You just don't know. Where are the kids in Stanley?
My kids?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're in the US, and yeah, it's just been, so one is in Minnesota, and I thought he was good until the riots. And I mean, Scott, are you guys back working in the office, or are you working from home?
No, yeah, it's still working from home. We're talking about a return to the office next week, but it'll be on a voluntary basis. We're not require people to go back. Yeah, I've got used to working from home and quite enjoy it.
Yeah, and if you can get it done, you know.
Yeah, you're the leaving work at 6 or 7 o'clock and being home at 6 or 7 o'clock is great. You walk out of the office and you're home.
Yeah. I've had mixed feelings about it, though. I've had people that said that working from home it was flexible and it's great, but there's no shutdown time, as in, you know, people now are like, oh, well, you're home. So the typical 5 o'clock ending, or 6 o'clock, whatever, 7, based on how busy you were, you know, dragged on to 9 and 10 because, you know, people expected. So I guess there's the negatives and the positives.
Yeah. But I think, like anything, it's learning and adapting, right? So you've got to set new rules. I'm quite comfortable that I work till 7, 8 o'clock. When I leave my desk, I'm not working for the rest of the night. If someone desperately needs me, they know to phone. You know, there's some urgent, they know to call me. But I won't sit and look at emails all night. I think, certainly for me, I need that release and that time off.
I agree. It's again, it's a change in behavior, different styles, and you kind of have to adapt to it and set the rules, especially if it's going to continue to be moving forward. That's how you're going to operate. If you're going to be working from home, you're going to have to, the weekend is the weekend, or, you know, whatever arrangement you have with your company, but the rules have to be respected both ways. But
that new norm, you know, from a real estate perspective, is going to be really interesting.
You know, so we're going to see it differently.
Okay, Hiba, we can start.
Shall we?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I apologize. It is 1 p.m. and you've been hearing us chatting, Scott and I. So I want to welcome everyone that has joined us. My name is Hiba Jaber. I'm a trainer and a consultant with Dubai Real Estate Institute. Of course, I have my colleague who's also a trainer and a consultant for Dubai Real Estate Institute with me this morning, Scott. We have, as DREI, started this series of what we call DREI Talks as an initiative in order to be able to cater to you, our real estate stakeholders, on different topics and different matters that, of course, are of interest to you. We've had many sessions so far. Sessions ranged from discussing matters pertaining to landlord-tenant, pertaining to jointly owned properties, pertaining to management and owners association. I've had actually a couple sessions on digital marketing and the skills that you need to have in place in order to be able to upskill yourself to deal with everything that caused this world to change post, of course, COVID-19. Today's session, what we're focusing more on is anything legal. So anything real estate and legal at the same time. I'd like to start by introducing, of course, my panelist, Scott. As I said, Scott is my colleague. He is a lawyer and a partner at Squire Patton Boggs, and of course, a DREI trainer. The company that Scott works for is one of the world's top 20 law firms. Scott specializes in construction and real estate law. He's been in Dubai for the past 12 years. He deals with disputes in local courts, DIFC courts, and arbitration. He also sits as an arbitrator on the Independent Governance Committee responsible for sourcing of gold and precious metals at DIFC. He's a member of the Pro Bono Committee of DIFC courts, and he's the founding trustee of Finding Your Feet charity, which was founded when Scott's sister lost her hands and legs to sepsis 6 years ago. Honestly, Scott, welcome. Thank you. Amazing. I'm pretty much very much interested in the last point, which is something I did not know about you. But of course, I'd love to have that talk with you on a different day. Thank you for your time and for joining us this morning.
No problem. Thank you, Hiba. And hello, everybody. Welcome to my home, which is not something we get to say terribly often in a work context. I should apologize in advance. I am not the most technically gifted in the world in IT issues. Some of you may have noticed that I managed to switch my video off there, but we're back. And I also apologize in advance for any interruptions. We may have two-legged or four-legged visitors at some point, and my apologies. We'll do what we can to keep that minimal.
Well, that's what makes it natural, right? And that's good. That's
yeah.
What makes it genuine.
Yeah. So 3 topics I'm going to cover briefly in a little presentation here. We're going to look at powers of attorney. A little bit general on powers of attorney, but there have been some updates and guidance issued by the Land Department, so that's why we want to look at this. Also look at force majeure, because it's clearly a massive hot topic at the moment. And then lastly, we'll look at anti-money laundering and combating terrorism financing, which may sound rather irrelevant, but for the real estate industry, it is hugely important, and to my mind has been largely ignored, and we need to fix that. Okay, so powers of attorney. Very generally, what is a power of attorney? I apologize if I'm telling you things you already know. But legally speaking, power of attorney is a document that authorizes someone else to do something on your behalf. So I can authorize Hiba to open a bank account in my name, for example. We can create them locally in the UAE, as many of you will know. That's done through the Notary Public. It's overseas. It's a much more involved process involving notarization, attestation, and legalization. Ultimately ends up at the UAE embassy and then comes to Dubai or the UAE and stamped by Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that's kind of general overview. Specifically on real estate, a power of attorney is limited to a specific property. So if you're selling property under a power of attorney, you must list that property, must be specified in the document. Dubai Notary will not issue a general power of attorney for the sale of real estate. Okay, so we can have a number of properties listed, but we have to identify them on the document. Power of attorney is limited in time for real estate purposes, so it's limited to a maximum of 2 years on a sale, 5 years on a purchase, unless revoked or cancelled earlier. Now, I'm sure there are brokers on this call at the moment who are thinking powers of attorney doesn't really apply to me. We can act under a power of attorney, but that has changed. Okay, and we'll look at that in a sec. But when I'm talking about powers of attorney, I regularly tell people that there are documents that frighten me. I regularly work under a power of attorney. And that power of attorney can be revoked or cancelled at any time without the grantor having to tell me. So I'm authorised under a power of attorney to sell a property on behalf of a client. I go ahead and complete a contract for the sale. Unbeknown to me, the client has cancelled the power of attorney. I am now potentially personally liable for any losses suffered by the buyer in that transaction. Okay, so I am very, very nervous of them. If you're dealing with a power of attorney, always check its validity before signing anything. You can now check that on the Dubai Court's website. It's really easy to do. You put in the details, it will tell you valid, invalid. Okay, and that covers or protects you. Power of attorney also expires automatically upon the death of a grantor. And again, the best will in the world, if a client of mine dies, I am not going to be the first person that the family notify. Okay, so I'm at risk of taking action under that power of attorney when it has been automatically revoked. All right, just another point to be aware of. So this is the more interesting part. What is new? And the first point on here, I think, is the biggest. It's the most important. A power of attorney holder can now collect a manager's check in his name upon the sale of a property. So selling a property, someone with a power of attorney can receive the sale proceeds, okay, in his own name, manager's check in that individual's own name. This is a big change and a big step forward.
And indeed, Scott, I'll just add a couple points on that, just from a history perspective, and why this is a very important and I guess in a way a good change, because you know, once upon a time that was possible. Then Dubai Land Department changed the rules on that, and they said, no, the check has to be issued in the name of the person mentioned on the title deed, and specifically because of some of the abuse and the misuse, right, that was done by the power of attorney holders. And they said, okay, you know what, we're going to stop it altogether. I do believe part of the reason why they had to go back and allow the power of attorney holders to collect the checks in their name, if, of course, if the power of attorney specifically mentions that, is because of the fact that we do in Dubai mostly deal with investors, sellers, buyers that are out of the country, right? So part of, I think, again, Dubai Land Department trying to figure out ways to make it easier and adapt to the requirements of what the real estate market requires, to make it a bit more user-friendly for all the parties involved. I think they've kind of enabled that. Is that how you feel from your end is part of the reason why they did this change?
Absolutely. From my perspective, when I first moved to Dubai, as you said, 12 years ago, this was a marketplace unlike anything I had seen. 90% of transactions, maybe more, do not have legal involvement. So the only face of a transaction for an investor is the broker. Now, that broker then can't receive sale proceeds. Overseas investor doesn't have a bank account here. You know, how does that work? But this, I think, is definitely a step forward. It's a recognition of where we are, and it's facilitating business. Yeah, I think this is a really great move, as is the next point. So a broker can now act under a power of attorney. Again, broker will often be the face of a transaction to a client. And we're now saying that the broker can act under a power of attorney. But it's important to distinguish they can act under a power of attorney as a party representative, not as a broker. Okay? It's a conflict of interest point. To me, I've always said, legally, there is no reason a broker cannot act as a power of attorney in terms of strict law, previously, before this new guidance. But it was just a practice that evolved because of conflicts of interest. So it made sense to limit a broker's involvement. However, oftentimes, more often than not, one rule does not fit all. And that's what we're faced with here. So now we're saying brokers can act on behalf of a client under a power of attorney, but they cannot act as a broker in that same transaction. You know, that seems fair. That is perfectly balanced, and it prevents a conflict of interest, which is where the power of attorney issue arose.
So in simple language, if I'm a broker and my client approaches me and says, you know, Hiba, I don't know anyone else here. I trust you. I want you to be my power of attorney holder. By me saying yes and accepting that role, I'm simply giving up my role as a broker, and as such, I won't be entitled to receiving any commission. So, you know, this is something which definitely the broker needs to be aware of, you know, because by accepting this, and that's not only myself, neither can anybody else from my office, from that brokerage company. They cannot technically now broker the deal and gain from it, because like you mentioned, Scott, they are now actually more power of attorney representative. So they're giving up their role. And yes, that's allowed. As you said, potentially it's good. It gives more flexibility, but brokers, they really need to know that by doing this, they're giving up their right to the commission.
However, what the guidance doesn't say is that the representative cannot obtain a fee for that representation. You know, if I'm acting under a power of attorney, I'm being paid for that as a lawyer. Now, I'm not saying it's acceptable. I'm saying there's a grey area here, and I think we'll see the guidance develop to confirm that. You know, where a broker is acting as a representative, are they not entitled to any fee? That's not clear at the moment. So we need to just dig a little bit deeper into that.
I think as a commission, from a commission perspective, I know this is something that Dubai Land Department, just talking to them recently, they said you can't. But if we're looking at, you know, from a lawyer's perspective, of course, you are entitled to getting fees because you're really technically representing your client. But of course, it's a space that we would like to watch and I guess get a little bit more information about it from DLD's representatives.
Yeah, agreed. And that's something we'll work out as we go forward. Another point that's just been confirmed with the guidance on conflict of interest is that a broker cannot act for a seller where he's purchasing in his own name. Okay, and again, that makes perfect sense to me. If I, as a broker, am buying a property for myself, neither I nor a member of my company can be taking a fee for the sale of that property. Okay, so sure. Just straightforward conflict of interest point. Multiple powers of attorney are allowed now between first and second degree relatives. So for example, I'm instructed by a client to sell a property. I can now automatically, or I can assign that power of attorney to my relatives, you know, who can assign it again between first and second degree relatives. The power of attorney can be passed on effectively. If a power of attorney has always been capable of being assigned, but if it's not to a relative, direct first, second degree relative, that must be expressly stated in the power of attorney. Okay, so for me to appoint someone else who's not a relative, it must expressly state in the power of attorney that I can do so. Okay, so hope that is clear. And the last point that was confirmed recently or clarified, or you know, there were other points, but these we've picked out or I picked out what I consider to be the most important ones. Gifted properties. So you no longer need to retain a gifted property for a period of a year before regifting. Okay, so gifted properties can now be transferred. There's no minimum holding period.
Yeah, and that's, again, I think, Scott, a little bit of history there. Why do DLD stop certain practices? Simply because of abuse and misuse. So we found, because you know how with the transferring between first of kin relatives, you know, that's when they call it the gifting or the hiba. And of course, the fees are less, so 0.125% of the valuation. So I think, but that only applied, of course, between first of kin, so parents to children, children to parents, husband, wife, wife, husband. But then they started the trend of having brothers transferring to the mother at 0.125%, and then the mother transferring, just so that it's double the 0.125%, but they wanted to avoid paying the 4% from a brother to brother. And I think at one point DLD stopped that practice, but now they're back to saying, okay, you know what, within that year, we will allow the regifting, which I believe, again, it's part of the measures that they've kind of reconsidered. It in a way to, I guess, encourage people to go back into potentially either transferring the property because the fees are now less, of course.
Yeah, and look, thanks. That's really useful. I think this works well. I can tell anyone what the law is, but practice is often not exactly the same. And I think that's the way you've put that there is really helpful, because a real estate market functions by transfer, right? By movement. So anything that will allow easier movement of property, in my opinion, is to be considered a bonus, particularly in this period of time.
Totally agree, yes.
Okay, so there are the updates on powers of attorney. A lawyer's favourite at the moment is force majeure. Every lawyer in town is talking about force majeure. And
it's becoming like the trending word right now, right?
Yeah.
Everybody, it's trending.
Yeah. And you know the old saying, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. That is, a lot of the stuff I've read on force majeure, I don't consider to be correct. I'm not saying leave this to the lawyers, because we know everything, far from it. But it's important to really understand what it means. So a force majeure event is an event that makes performance of a contract impossible. Not difficult, not causing hardship, impossible, makes performance impossible. We traditionally consider force majeure events are often called acts of God. So there's an earthquake, selling a building, an earthquake, building collapses, the sale of that building has become impossible because it is no longer there. Okay, that is a force majeure event. What we're seeing a lot of here, and the question of whether COVID-19 is a force majeure event or not, very much depends on the circumstances of the transaction, in my opinion. We look at the other option, legal option that's available, is doctrine of exceptional circumstances or hardship. And I've referenced two articles of the Civil Code. There are Article 273 of the UAE Civil Code is force majeure, and 249 is exceptional hardship, exceptional circumstances. And what that says is, in fact, I'll read it. I've got it here. Article 249. If exceptional circumstances of a public nature which could not have been foreseen occur, as a result of which the performance of the contractual obligation, even if not impossible, becomes oppressive for the obliger, so as to threaten him with grave loss, the court will have the option to lessen the obligations. Okay, so exceptional circumstances of a public nature, yep, COVID, tick that box. Unforeseen, yes.
100%. Totally
yeah.
Took us by surprise.
If we were writing a contract now, though, it would not be unforeseen, right? As we know it's there. In these circumstances, you can apply to the court to lessen the obligations. And there's been a really good example come out of the RDC, the Rent Dispute Centre, just in the last week or so. And thanks to our colleague Ghanem at the Real Estate Institute for sharing this. There was a situation where, as a result of the pandemic, a tenant lost their job, so was unable to pay their rent under a lease. The RDC have looked at that and said, okay, exceptional circumstances, of a public nature that were unforeseen, we're going to allow this tenant to terminate their contract early. Okay, so the tenant could terminate their contract because of this doctrine of exceptional circumstances. Not force majeure, exceptional circumstances in this case. And I wrote these slides before learning about that case. So I've written COVID-19 as a force majeure event, a real estate transaction, not sure. Exceptional circumstances, probably. Okay, now.
And it's looked at, I guess, on a case-by-case basis by the judge. If we reference back the point you're discussing, Scott, with the RDC, I think one of the main things that they're going to look at on whether to accept termination of the contract by the tenant is prove to me that, your loss of job was due to, measures that resulted from COVID-19. I think, and this is just to add to your point, again, as I mentioned, you're my colleague, so we all kind of work together, and we always try to find ways to help our stakeholders in any way we can. So I've had discussions also with judges at the RDC, and they said, Hiba, yes, we are looking for proof because, you could have been, sorry to say, a bad employee to begin with. You were on probation, or you would have received many warnings saying, you mess up one more time, you're out. Now, are we going to allow him to terminate because now he's claiming that he lost his job due to COVID-19? I think evidence is very important, and they are requesting a lot of documentation.
Very much so, and yeah, that is entirely right. For example, I could be saying, I'm sitting here, let's say, well, let's not use me as an example. You get an individual sitting, doing well, no consequences with his job, still making plenty of money, but the market is in a downturn, right? Market is down, so there are opportunities. Could someone see that as an opportunity to terminate their lease and go and pick up a cheaper rent? Yes, they could, but exactly to your point, the RDC judges are going to be looking for proof that they have suffered hardship to an extent that makes it very, very difficult for them to perform their lease obligation, i.e. pay the rent.
Another example they gave me, Scott, could we also adding value to our participants today, is an example of a commercial rent when a lot of them are requesting either reduction in the fees, freezing of the fees, or termination of contracts. What the judges are saying is, prove to me. They're looking, for example, they're going as far as saying, show me your VAT return, right? Because this time of year, last year, because I want to make sure that what you're claiming was because of COVID-19 and because of the shutdown by the government or the lockdown by the government where you couldn't perform your business, because you know what, it could have been that your business wasn't doing well to begin with, regardless of COVID. So just to add to your point, that they are recognizing certain situations, but they're looking for proof and they're requiring a lot of documentation.
Yeah, and I know from an authority's perspective that is very much the case. So we had the Dubai economic
development,
the stimulus package that was released.
Sure.
So involved all the free zone authorities, and the free zone authority have said, look, we accept there's a problem here. We're willing to listen, but you're going to have to prove to us that you've got problems. Okay, yeah. So it's exactly that. You've got to submit accounts. People here are often reluctant to do that, but if you've got nothing to hide, if you're being genuine, let's get them out there. You submit
it, and your rights will be preserved. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so that covers force majeure, and now AML, anti-money laundering, and CTF, combating terrorism finance. This is a topic I take really seriously because I'm the money laundering reporting officer for our firm. And in short, if anyone in our firm in Dubai, our office, is in breach of the money laundering obligations, I'm going to jail and that individual is going to jail. Okay, so as a reporting officer, I've got to take this really seriously. And perhaps I'm over-egging it, but I genuinely think we're going to see real enforcement here. Okay, federal law 2018, the anti-money laundering and AML/CTF law of 2018 made a big difference here. There was already an AML law from 2002, but the 2018 amendments really kind of changed the nature of things. And we're now in a position where, make no mistake, these laws apply to us in the real estate community. Real estate brokers are expressly classed as what are called DNFBPs. So that's a designated non-financial body or profession. So a real estate broker is expressly classed as a DNFBP and therefore expressly included in the law. And the point to the law is that if a broker facilitates a transaction that is laundering money, that broker is guilty of the same crime as the actual bad guy, right? The guy that's actually laundering the money. So we have to be really careful in the real estate industry generally. You know, I have to do AML checks on all my clients. And that's why I've got the point, is it relevant? Yes, it's really relevant. There was a FATF report, which is the second bullet point there, the Financial Action Task Force. So they've reported a few times on the UAE's laws combating money laundering and terrorism financing. The latest assessment was done this year, in April of this year. And in short, what it said was that the system is in place, but there's not enough enforcement action around it. The laws and the rules are there, but we're not convinced that they're being properly applied by everyone and they're not being properly enforced. I think this is a massive warning for all of us that we now need to comply with these rules. Make no mistake, we must comply. And I think there will be enforcement action to come. I think we're going to see more enforcement over the next year or two. So something we
especially,
all have to
Scott, if we're talking about the penalties could be as far as you can get imprisoned. Yani it's a serious violation.
Absolutely. You know, it's one of these, if you consider it in a risk basis, what are the chances you, if we're doing everything right, but we haven't properly reviewed our documents, what are the chances of me getting caught for this, right? Yeah, don't know. I mean, they're probably substantial now, but more important, what is the consequences if I do get caught? I'm going to jail. You know, make no bones about it. People will be going to jail for this. So it is just not worth the risk, particularly when you look at what you have to do. Okay, and there's a slide here which I've really put up for interest, which hopefully we can share with everyone. The points to look at, it gives you what is money laundering, what is terrorism financing. But the money laundering crime is the important one to me at federal level. If a person is aware that the money in a transaction, so buying a property on behalf of someone, if you're aware that that money is derived from a felony or misdemeanor, willfully commits any of the following acts. So transfer, move, deposit, keep, invest that money. Okay, so buy a property, or conceal or disguise the real source, location, method of disposition, blah, blah, blah. Okay? The original crime need not be proved for the latter issue of money laundering to be proved. Long way of saying, if you facilitate a transaction that you knew about, or you knew there was a risk, or you should have known there was a risk, okay? By doing your due diligence, you should have known there was a risk, and that is a crime of money laundering. Right.
So Scott, if you allow me to just ask you this question, just for the benefit of those that are joining us, again, targeting real estate stakeholders and brokers in today's session, what type of advice would you give the brokers in order to alert them? Like what sort of things they need to keep their eyes on to make sure that they don't get involved in something as serious as facilitating money laundering acts?
Yeah, and great question, thank you. Perfect segue into the next and last slide. it's pretty easy to protect yourself here. All right, it's just about two processes: KYC, know your customer, and CDD, customer due diligence.
Correct.
All right, and you see we've got two guys in jail there. The guy on the left is the money laundering bad guy, guilty, and the other guy is you or me, who's also in jail because we knew and did nothing, or should have known and did nothing. Right? What we need to do to protect ourselves is just establish documentation. Anyone that's tried to open a bank account in the last 5 years knows the process that's involved in the documentation that's got to be provided. That's all what we're looking at here, and not to the same depth. So know your customer. We need to know who our customer is. If it's an individual, I want to see a passport. Okay, I want to see the passport or ID card to know that I'm dealing with the same person. If it's a corporate structure, I need to know who owns the company, what's called the UBO, the ultimate beneficial owner. So if it's a company owned by a company, owned by a company, I've got to keep going until I get to people. I've got to establish those people or identify those people. They're the UBOs.
And if it gets too difficult for a broker to, get involved in that, seek help, seek legal help. Don't take it upon yourself to figure out like, oh, it's a company owned by a company, and I'm lost. Seek legal help. Just make sure you take it seriously because this could potentially be held against you.
Absolutely. And there are third parties out there that will do all this for you. If you do a Google search for corporate service providers, most of them or lots of them will do this for you. Okay, so you can offload the risk. But just as long as we know that there is a risk there, and we've got to be aware of it. So that's the KYC, know your customer, the CDD, customer due diligence. For that, we need to know where the money's coming from and how did they get this money, right? We're not expected to be forensic investigators here. We need something that on the face of it seems legit, a bank reference, which everyone should now have. Pretty much everyone has a bank account. So a bank reference letter, company accounts here where we've got VAT returns going in now that you've already referenced. These documents should be available, right? Let us see them and we're comfortable.
You're saying cash is a huge red flag there.
Absolutely. The cash is king. Nah.
Not
Cash
in those type of transactions. Yeah. So yeah, what's the source of that cash at the end of the day? You want to be able to establish the source. So that's great. So anything else from
client walking into your office to buy a property with a bag of money? There's alarm bells going everywhere.
And that's prior to COVID-19 and post COVID-19. Nothing changed with that, right?
Absolutely. And one other point worth noting on this. So if you've got a transaction that worries you, you have to report that. You have an obligation to report that to the central bank or the police. And in the act of reporting it, it's an offence to tip off the client. So if you say to the client, look, I'm sorry, I can't represent you because I'm worried about money laundering risks, you've just committed an offence. You've tipped them off, all right? So you just decline to act. There's no reasons given, all right?
So it is a serious and complicated issue, so definitely watch out for it. Especially, I think, Scott, something that I'm happy that you addressed in today's session, because of course, everything is moving through the digital, right? Everything is going digital age, be it because of Corona or not, blockchain transactions. Again, this is, I think, one of the biggest concerns and risks associated with these type of transactions, because those laws exist, and if anything, they need to be taken into consideration even more than a typical maybe person-to-person type of transaction.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And I don't want to scare anyone with money laundering rules. It's just an understanding that we've got
the laws are there.
Yeah.
The laws are there, and yeah. Okay, Scott, if it's okay with you and recognizing that we have a good 15 more minutes to go, we have few questions that are coming in from the audience that I'll start looking at. But before I do that, you know, I've asked around and I've already have a list of questions that people wanted me to address in today's session. I want to start by addressing just some pointers from your legal perspective on inheritance. I personally get this question pretty much in every single class I've taught over the past 10 years. And the question is, does Sharia law apply to inheritance of property? And I always tell them, wait for the third day and ask my legal, colleague to answer that question, you know, because it is very legal, right? So
Yeah.
I'll leave it to you to give us a little bit more about this, please.
Sure. I guess the first point here, and keep it short, in principle and a start point, yes, Sharia law will apply. For Muslims, Sharia law will always apply to matters of personal affairs, okay, which includes inheritance. For non-Muslims, if there's no will in place, Sharia law will apply as the governing law of the country. Okay, but we can put a will in place. Muslims can prepare and submit a will as well, but under Sharia law, maximum, I think, of 1/3 of an estate can be dispersed according to a will, and the rest is dispersed according to Sharia principles. For non-Muslims, we can register a will at either DIFC probate centre or Dubai courts, and then that will be followed by the courts. Okay, the courts have been doing this for a good few years now. They're well used to it. You can do it English language at DIFC or Arabic language at Dubai courts. And either way, the will is very likely to be followed. Okay, so if you're a non-Muslim owning property, or you have a client who's non-Muslim owning property here, I would say they should definitely have a will registered, or put the property in a corporate structure. Okay, corporate structure doesn't distinguish between religions, right? And a corporate structure never dies. So if you put an asset into the corporate structure, then you can avoid these inheritance issues.
And that's good to know, because, you know, I've had a lot of people that had the misunderstanding that just because I'm non-Muslim, that doesn't mean that Sharia law applies to me, you know, because they didn't have that awareness. But recognizing that it does, especially when it comes to, you know, I guess real estate and property, I think it's definitely worth their while to look into potentially having a will registered, like you mentioned, either at the IFC or Dubai courts. Another question, and then of course I'll also look through the audience. Client bought off plan and the developer is delayed. What can a buyer do? It's becoming more pertinent in today's market than anything. So can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, so look, for those of us that have been around Dubai for a while, we've been here before, post-financial crisis. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of cases going through the Dubai courts where developer is delayed. Unfortunately, there's no one answer. Right? It's very subjective. Each case has to be considered in its own merits, and the starting point will always be your contract. What does your contract say? You know, first points I would be looking at are the completion date in terms of the contract. Do we have a set completion date, or do we have an anticipated completion date? Can the developer extend that completion date? What are the rules there in the contract? And what does it say about termination? All right, so we need to look at our contracts, a starting point. In a lot of classes I teach, I get asked, are you seriously telling us clients should read the SPA? Absolutely. This is, to many people, a property purchase will be their most expensive transaction they ever complete in their life. To do that without reading the terms of your contract, you've got to know what it says. A contract is just an allocation of risk. You know, it's what are you responsible for? What am I responsible for? Understanding where the contract sits, we can assess what we're prepared to accept. So that's the start point, the contract. The law does make certain provision. So there's a provision in the law that says if one party to a contract is not performing their obligations, then the other party is entitled to withhold performance. So in this scenario, if the developer is not building, the buyer doesn't have to continue to pay. Okay, but we shouldn't really see much argument about that now, because payment plans should be tied to construction, right?
Yes.
So as long as the developer is building, they should be entitled to be paid. But you have a scenario, property was due to be delivered January 2020, that's come and gone. I know it's at least a year away from being built. Do I just have to accept that? If I've got a mortgage, the bank will probably be requiring my mortgage payments from an agreed date, so I'm paying. What can I do? Again, it really comes down to the ins and outs of your contract and what your contract says on it. There will be a termination provision. But long and short, if the developer is not performing their obligations under the contract, you're entitled to ask the court to terminate that contract. Then it becomes a subjective test from the court, or answer from the court as to whether they will allow that or not, based on the terms of your contract.
And from your legal practice, Scott, have you seen a lot of cases where the court, for example, ruled in favor of one party versus the other in such cases that made it to court?
Yeah, there've been hundreds, if not thousands of them. And they're very much subjective. However, my reading of the overall picture is that if the developer is building, although delayed, if they're continuing to work, then the court tends, my experience tends to side with the developer. But of course, subject to the terms of each individual contract.
And I believe this is why a lot of stakeholders, investors, and buyers, they're asking for a unified contract by DREI for the off-plan, I think, because they often feel that it tends to be one-sided. Of course, because it's created by the developer, it just makes sense that it would be benefiting or recognizing his best interest over the client's, right?
Yeah. I think, and this is something we've discussed previously, I think there is an opportunity for a form of standardized contract here. But I'm a firm believer in freedom of contract. If you and I agree on a deal, then we're bound by that deal. The fact that in 6 months down the line, I don't like it anymore, that's not how the law works. However, there are so many terms to an SPA that could be standardized. So we could have, as I see it, a template of standard terms and conditions that go into every contract. Then you have your additional comments. Not unlike the standard form of Jari lease, where you have set conditions and you can add others to it. But
correct.
I think we could see that down the line.
Scott, I just want to mention something that Dr. George, again, thanks Dr. George for joining us. He had a comment and a question pertaining to the POA. The question is, you have mentioned POA is valid for 3 years. Dr. George, that was 2 years, not 3 years on sales, and 5 years for purchase. So his question, Scott, is, should the DLD honor such POA, or does it have to be renewed every 2 years in order for it to be accepted?
Legally, it has to be renewed because it's invalid after that period. So yeah, should be renewed every 2 years.
So on sales, it has to be renewed every 2 years, and on purchase, it has to be every 5 years.
5, yeah.
Okay. Another question from Dr. George. Banks often do not honor general POA unless a separate bank POA is signed. Is this legal?
That's a great question, Dr. George. You're always one for getting them in. Is it legal? There is no requirement on any party to accept a power of attorney, right? if I walk into your office, you don't have to do business with me, and you don't have to accept whatever documents I have. However, I've had arguments in courts and arbitrations about powers of attorney because they're often used here as, certainly in the disputes process, as a way to prolong things, to be difficult. I would say, yes, it probably is legal. The bank can accept whatever document it decides. However, that document has been stamped and signed by a notary public, part of the Dubai courts. It's a brave party that wants to take on Dubai courts, essentially. If you were to go to court, the court would probably enforce that power of attorney, I would expect. Sorry, George, I'm not really answering your question here, but there isn't a definitive answer.
Well, it kind of does, because, I guess what you're saying, Scott, is, anybody can impose their own, I guess, policies, procedures. So that's what the banks are doing. But I guess from a legal standpoint, if it ever goes to court, the courts might say, listen, this is acceptable from a legal standpoint, regardless of what your policies and procedures. So I think they would have to, as always, look at all the documentations that's being provided. Right, Scott?
Yeah, but equally, look, the bank are saying we want to use this form of power of attorney. Yeah, if that's acceptable to the notary public, it's a bit of a nuisance. It's going to take some more time, but unfortunately, it is what it is.
I have another question, and again, I'm just going to quickly go through them just because we are running out of time. I just want to let you know, Aista, don't worry. There was a recommendation that we have a separate session altogether on will and inheritance, so we can go into further depth. So hopefully, Scott, you would honor us in your presence again.
I think that's a good idea.
To do another session on that. I have John, and again, thanks, John, for joining us. He's saying, Scott, most developers require customers to pay down payment first before they issue the SPA. So can those customers get the refund if they haven't signed the SPA?
That's a difficult one, and it's an awkward practice. So you put a deposit down and you sign a booking form. Right? And generally that booking form will say you've seen and accept the terms of the SPA, or often will say that. In which case, even if you haven't seen it, you're going to be bound by the terms of the SPA, unless you can prove you've never seen it. Okay,
which again stresses your point. Read the documentation, read your SPA, read your booking form, read your reservation if we're talking about tenancies, because at the end of the day, you are signing a legal document, and this could be held against you or could limit what your rights are if you don't abide by it, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could, your deposit is very much at risk there. To me, it's pretty straightforward. I wouldn't sign that because it says I've seen a document that I haven't seen. However, if we look at a scenario, particularly back in the day, when the property market was moving so quickly, if I don't sign that deposit and accept it, the person behind me is going to. I'm going to miss the opportunity. And these are the risks you take. But to me, that just shouldn't be happening. If I'm presented with that document and I really want to sign this and buy this property, maybe I sign the deposit or the booking form, but I score out and initial the part that says I've seen the SPA. Okay, then my only contract is this booking form.
Yeah.
I'm excluding the SPA.
Yeah. I have one great question from Dr. George as well. Does force majeure applies to DEWA, due and itisalat, who are disconnecting services for delayed payments? What's your legal advice on that topic?
Now, there's a hot one. Look, force majeure is a legal principle that applies across the country. It's written into the civil code. So yes, it does apply. However, where force majeure, remember, it comes in where the transaction has become impossible
Yeah.
not difficult. So someone not paying their DREI payment because money's a bit tight, it's not impossible. However, perhaps it is a circumstance of extreme hardship. But I can't see DREI or Etisalat reducing the fees on that basis, or being forced to, they're utility providers. So in principle, the doctrine of exceptional circumstances will apply. However, a court reducing the obligations or the price on a DREI or Etisalat contract, I find that hard to see, to be honest.
I think, Scott, my only and of course I'm not legal and I'm not trying to pretend that I know things that we don't know, right? I mean, it comes down to COVID-19. There's nothing like it. And it's not something that is exclusive to Dubai or the UAE. I mean, we're all have been attending so many webinars and reading so many articles and watching a lot of, TV and news, and there's always this. Everybody has managed. All experts have given answers to certain questions and have left that element of uncertainty at the end where we're just not sure, because this is not something that have been encountered before.
Yeah, it is something I've noted down here, that we're entering potentially a brave new world. It's unlike anything I suspect any of us have experienced in our lifetimes. The new normal, what's that going to look like? We just don't know.
We don't know.
What we've seen, from the leadership all the way down in the UAE, I think we're seeing an acceptance that we're in this together. And that's how things move forward. So the commercial realities are a very different thing from the legalities of it. So your commercial rents, from a landlord's perspective, it's better to receive a little rent than to receive no rent, right? From a DREI perspective, if they're cutting people off, surely it's better to receive something than nothing. I would expect DREI or the utility providers generally to take a commercial approach to this, because it's what we've seen from the very top, from the leadership. The free zone authorities, the stimulus package is all about managing the effect of this.
Absolutely.
I would expect them to at least negotiate.
I agree with you, Scott, especially, just stressing on the point of the leadership within the UAE. I mean, just from what I've read regarding RDC during the lockdown, they came out on multiple occasions using their channels, their social media channels, telling landlords, you have no right whatsoever to take matters into your hand, disconnecting DREI for the tenant or doing anything that would prevent him from enjoying the property during this, if you want to call it force majeure or unusual circumstance. So there was that kind of feel that we're in it together and we're going to try the best we can in order to come out. And but we have to also be fair to both parties. You have to be able to, like you said, how is it fair for DREI now to not be able to collect their fees? So it's a tough situation to be in. We are running out of time, so I'm going to ask you one last question, just because it was repeated in one way or another, and it is pertaining to landlord and tenants. What do you believe, in your opinion, or from your expertise, what are the new challenges and different stakeholders' behavior that you're observing facing COVID-19 in real estate rentals? If you could just give us an overview on that, I would appreciate it.
In terms of rentals generally, where is this going? We've seen COVID clearly has had a huge impact. Whether that be pay cuts, people putting unpaid leave, redundancies, all of these impact the real estate market, because ultimately everyone lives and works somewhere, right? So there's always a rental requirement. What we're going to see when we come out of this, I don't know. Are we going to see a lot of people leaving? I'm sure there will be people leaving, but there may well be others coming in. But, you know, coming back to the leadership point, I think in many ways, and look, I don't want to come across as particularly pro or con anything or be taking a political stance here, but I think we're very lucky in this country. We have a government and a leadership that is nimble and can react quickly. You know, they were proactive in this. They got in front of it. Yeah, as you will have guessed, or many of you will know, I'm from the UK. I think the UAE was one of the fastest to act and take action here, and that is a feature of the government. We react quickly. We've seen through the period, the last few months of lockdown, we've seen more and more smart technology come online. And Dubai was already pushing that envelope. The smart tech was already here. You know, there's a move towards smart government. You know, the Ajari system, you can do that all online now with the is it REST or is it REST system?
Dubai REST app, yeah.
Dubai REST.
Dubai REST,
I've been saying that REST in it, it makes me want to sing. There should be an RESPECT there. But so we can do the whole Ajari system online now through landlord or tenant. DREI, I remember I used to go to DREI every month to pay my bill. Now I'm on the app and you deal with that very quickly and very easily. Look, there are issues and there's a way to go, but I really believe that Dubai in particular is at the forefront here and is moving forward, and will continue to see more in the way of smart tech coming. I think we'll also see offers out there. You know, there's going to be, I'm sure there's going to be a resetting of the commercial office space as people have become much more comfortable working from home. What's going to happen to those spaces? We'll see developers and institutional landlords, such as they are, I think, offering incentives, whether that be rent-free periods, payment plans, deferred rents. As I mentioned earlier, the economic stimulus package and the free zones offer deals. You know, so they have deferred rents, or allowing companies to defer rents as long as they can prove they've been financially impacted, which I would suggest most firms or companies have been. The Land Department waived registration fees for a period. I think we'll see more and more stimulus measures introduced depending on where this goes, you know, but I think the government's been very reactive. I think they've dealt with it admirably, and I think we could well.
One point, Scott, sorry to interrupt. They didn't necessarily waive the registration fees, but the fines on the late fees.
Sorry, yeah.
So just I want to make sure, because the last thing we want is to create a...
Yeah,
so
that would encourage the market.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to waive it, but they actually did waive the fines. So thank you.
It was a fine for late payment of registration fees, right?
Correct.
So to come back, and I'm not sure I answered your question there, but I think the point is we'll see smart tech evolve. There's something in the legal industry we're talking a lot about, artificial intelligence. I could a computer do my job better than me? A lot of it, yes. There's a lot of our job that is assessing information and giving a result. Fortunately, I think there's also a human element required, certainly in part of it, but I have no doubt that the legal industry is already embracing artificial intelligence, and it will continue. And I think we'll see that across the board. One of the conversations we had at our last group meeting was about smart tech in malls and mall operators. How can they use tech to improve their yield? They've got to be working on things like that now. You know,
yeah.
The market has changed again, and I'm sure we'll see some innovation there.
And I think COVID-19 is forcing everyone to be innovative. You know, whatever was on that, it was on the list, but maybe not number one on the list, has now to be kind of reshuffled. Put, you know, technology, digital transformations, innovations on your number one priority, because there are companies, there are people in different professionals that are already doing that, and we're going to hear about them in 2 months. And if you're not on board and you have not done so, you're going to be left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, 2 months' time or in a year's time doing this webinar, we have a robot sitting here.
Well, hopefully not. Let's. I'd like to think.
And you can all feel sorry for me.
I'd like to think, Scott, that we would still continue our expertise and our faces would still be in demand. But with that said, I really want to thank you. Thank you for giving us the time. I know you're very busy, and your time means so much to us. I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Aiste, and Dr. George and John and Matthew for attending. And I believe Hind was also attending the session. I have to also thank Saji, who's always doing a great help facilitating and actually managing those webinars. So thank you, Saji, and thanks to everybody. And hopefully I'll hold you to your promise that we will have another session addressing wills and inheritance in further depth, if you don't mind, Scott.
Yeah, well, thank you, Heba. But can I also add to that? I would really like to see DREI. I think it would be useful to do a focused AML session.
I totally agree. I've learned a lot just from whatever we've discussed. So I think we'll put it up for DREI and him to look into that. And we can also count on your expertise and legal perspective to join us in that session as well.
Maybe not in the expertise, but I'm certainly happy to join you.
The legal know-how. How about that? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Heba. Thank you, Saji. Thank you, everyone.